In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of Last Best Constitution. As you know, in this year of 2022, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Montana Constitutional Convention of 1972 and the 50th anniversary of the adoption of their product, the Montana Constitution, in the June election of 1972. And in recognition of that, we are having interviews and discussions and conversations with the remaining delegates from the Constitutional Convention. You know, the other day there were 12 remaining delegates to the Constitution out of 100. And so their voices are very precious and need to be heard, and we need to hear their recollections. Regretfully, we lost Bob Campbell just the other night, so they're now only 11. And so again, capturing these voices, capturing these thoughts are imperative if we here in Montana are to benefit from their wisdom, their experience, and recognizing the historical value of the work that they did and understanding how it happened. So on today's episode, we reach way into the northeast corner of Montana to talk to Gene Harbaugh. Gene Harbaugh was a delegate from 4 counties, really 3.5. Daniels County, which is, people recognize the county seat is Scobie, Sheridan County, which the county seat was Plentywood, and then Roosevelt County, which we often think of as Wolf Point, and then of course the eastern portions of Valley County. That's the area that Gene represented, and we'll introduce him now and ask him for a couple. I'm going to ask him just to reflect momentarily about the whole idea about what made him think it might be a interesting or fun idea to help write a constitution for Montana. Gene, welcome to our series.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, first, you know, I'd like to express, I guess, my gratitude to you for doing these sessions, and also I have to express my gratitude to Bob Campbell and to his memory and and all that he did to promote the Constitution, to be a vital part, really, of the crafting of the document, and was without folks like him who had a world of experience and wisdom, you know, our Constitution wouldn't be what it is today. So, yeah.
Well, he is that, and the other thing that Bob was kind of the glue that kept the society together. The Constitutional Convention Society, which is an exclusive membership, is of delegates to the Constitution. And I understand the agreement is that when the last delegate passes, the society dissolves. But in the meantime, for decades, Bob was the secretary, and he was the one that got everyone together for 47 or 48, 49 years. And so it's going to be a sad day we don't have him here at our 50th anniversary in June. But for you, you were what at that time? You were
I was about 35.
35 years old, and you were a Presbyterian minister in Poplar, Montana, and you had to, and originally from the Jordan area, right?
Right, I grew up in Jordan.
The Harbaugh Ranch, which is, by the way, one of those recognized in the Montana Ranching Hall of Fame as one of those ranches that is owned by the same family for 100 years. And I understand it's being inducted into the Montana Ranching Hall of Fame this year. From there, tell me about, again, your thoughts about what came to your mind when you heard, hey, they might want citizens to help write a constitution.
Well, you know, I was not a person who had a lot of involvement in any kind of political action or anything like that. I was not an activist. I didn't have an agenda. I had, you know, I felt like I had an open mind toward the idea of developing a new constitution, and I thought maybe I understood what was right and wrong, and that I had a sense of justice and equity that I thought were important. And so early on, as I realized that this was coming down the road, the possibility of developing a new constitution, I struggled a lot with that. And I think a lot of my struggle had to do with where I was in my career. I had been at Poplar as the pastor there of the little Presbyterian church for about 7 years by that time. And, you know, things were going well in the parish. We were enjoying the community. But I was a little restless. I was at that stage when I thought, well, you know, maybe I ought to move on to something else. And one of the things that came along that sort of nurtured that sense of, you know, exploration of something new. There was a young Catholic priest in the community, and when I moved there, he was in the process of studying, by extension, a course in American Law and Procedure from LaSalle Extension University. So he talked me into joining him in this study. So I applied and, you know, went through the process, and I became a student of the Extension University. And it took about 5 years to complete this course. So he and I worked together on it initially, and then, wouldn't you know, he up and moved. So
he suckered you into it, and then he left you. Huh?
Yeah, and then he left. Yeah. But I continued. So I continued to study, and in my mind, I thought that it might be possible for a person to be an attorney in a small community and also pastor a congregation. And you know, today, that would be a very viable option. But in the 1970s, I explored that with denominational leaders and my church organization, and there was nobody that thought that was an idea that would fly. That both of the professions demanded so much that you couldn't do both, that you would have to commit, you know, to one or the other. Today, so many pastors are bivocational, And that's the only way the church has leadership in a lot of small communities. So it was an idea that I was exploring.
Well, let me just interrupt for a second. My recollection of LaSalle was that you could culminate the studies at LaSalle and go take the bar. And if you passed the bar, you'd become an attorney. And I know some attorneys in Montana, some prestigious attorneys who got their degree by doing it that way, and but they had to pass the bar. So you went and did all the work, and then it was kind of like, well, you don't get to do the bar. Huh?
Yeah. No, I did get to do the
did
bar.
you? Yeah.
Actually, I signed up for the bar, and but Montana, any state where you're going to sit for a bar exam is going to be really
it's tough.
Tough.
It's tough.
It lasted like the examination was like 3 days, and you went through oral examination, and American Law and Procedure from LaSalle did not prepare you in state law.
Montana law.
So I had no background in that, really. Yeah. And so as a result, I sat for the bar. And I thought I was doing real well the first day. But after about the second or third day, boy, I was in over my head, because there was a lot of stuff about state
water
statutes
law.
And law. Yeah, all that kind of thing that I just didn't have any background in. So I didn't pass the bar exam, but it was an experience that kind of opened me to some new possibilities, and so here I was struggling really with major career choices, and a part of what sort of pushed me toward the idea of maybe going to California and taking one of those courses of how you pass the state bar exam, what pushed me toward that was that I had, in the meantime, become a part of the Montana Bar Advisory Committee on Legal Services for the poor. Right. And of course, living on a reservation, that was a very pertinent kind of thing to be involved in.
Did you know Neil Haight? Neil and Legal Services, I thought, for Montana.
Yeah, I probably did. I don't remember those names over 50 years ago, but anyway, I was involved in that, and so deciding to run for the office was really a struggle for me. And it wasn't until the last day for filing that I decided to file. So I made the trip to Helena, drove all the way to Helena.
Long drive.
Yeah, it's about over 400 miles.
Yeah.
And filed my petition and came home. But I still remember going into Frank Murray's office. Frank Murray was the Secretary of State, and it was an interesting introduction to how a lot of Montanans reacted to the idea of change, doing something different with the fundamental document of the state. And Frank Murray was a very dour person, and he just I don't understand why you people are doing this. It isn't going to come to anything anyway. That was sort of the attitude that I got.
Well, there are two things you said that were really important from my experience. One is that you were about to craft the fundamental document for Montana, the fundamental legal understructure, the foundation for Montana, and that experience in thinking about being an attorney, I'm sure served you well, and you were intellectually prepared for that. The other was, of course, coming head on into Frank Murray, who, by the way, retained his not ambivalence but opposition to the idea of changing the Constitution. And I knew Frank, and Frank was from Butte, and the Anaconda Company was very strong in Butte, and he was an Anaconda Company Democrat, and he did not like the idea of changing the Constitution. Oh, no. Right down to the time he made Forrest Anderson sign the document twice in order for it to be certified. So you ran into some political reality there.
Yeah, that was an interesting introduction to it all, you know, to run into Frank Murray. But you know, I had no special skills except that I guess I was and maybe am something of a wordsmith. I think words matter, and also I'm a person who has always paid attention to detail. So, you know, I had some innate abilities and skills, I think, that were appropriate for the task, and you know, I really put myself into it. In fact, what I found after the election and moving to Helena and working on the Constitution for, what was it,
54 days.
54 days.
Yeah.
I found that it was a whole lot easier than being a pastor. A pastor never knows what's coming, you know, in the next hour.
Yeah.
And this was one thing that I could focus on, and did. And so in many ways, I had a kind of a vacation, you know, 3 months away from my parish. And while I was there, you know, Father John Hudak, the local priest of the local Catholic Church, took over my Lenten services at the Presbyterian Church, assisted with pastoral duties, and so, you know, I had a really good working relationship with other pastors, but especially with the Catholic parish there. And it was a time when there was a lot of change going on in the country, and one of those changes had to do with the ecumenical movement, which was really kind of maybe a little past its zenith at that time, but it was a reality in Poplar, Montana. And we cooperated on all kinds of things. And I even celebrated the Mass when they dedicated a new Catholic church in Poplar. And I don't know that that was done in very many places in the United States.
Well, you know, ecumenism was running rampant in the 60s, but, and by the way, something I think is something that ought to be permanent in the minds and hearts of people about religion is acceptance and working together. But that'll bring us, we'll have some discussion later in this hour about how that comes into play relative to secular education versus non-secular education in the Constitution. Now, when you came here, there were in the election, there were 58 Democrats, there were 36 Republicans, and 6 independents. And we'll talk a bit about the alphabetical seating, which kind of obliterated those party designations. But one thing that stuck out to me was that when we had things like we had Don Foster was a beekeeper, and we had all these different occupations, there were 6 ministers, 6 men of the cloth. I think they were all men of the cloth. There was you, George Harper, Bill Burkhardt. Who were there was
Harold Urbanus.
Harold Urbanus was priest from Great Falls, right? Who else?
Scanlon.
Oh yeah, Don Scanlon. I knew him because he was from Red Lodge. That was my hometown. He was in Billings at the time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
Don.
Yeah.
And see, Don, Harold, Burkhardt, Harper, you. Who's that 6th one? We'll have to. Well, let's not waste a lot of time. When it comes back, we'll blurt it out. That was kind of interesting. Did you think the people of the cloth that were there brought any kind of unique perspective? Was it evidenced by any of the discussions? And
oh, I think they did. I think, you know, delegates like George Harper played a really important part in the convention. Bill Burkhardt really, you know, played an important part. Bill Burkhardt was the chair of the committee that was to publish the Constitution in the state, and of course that's a story too of what happened there. But and
he was the person that actually was able to get the clean and healthful environment through motion into the Bill of Rights Committee as a fundamental right, as opposed to it had previously been put in the natural resource plank. But Bill was the one that said, let's put this in here as a fundamental right, inalienable right.
Bill was very sharp about that sort of thing, and I enjoyed working with him. So.
Well, when you came to Helena at the end of November, there was an organizing session, and you elected leadership. Now, out of the your 4-county area, your 3.5 county areas, there was yourself, and there was Roger Wagner, and there was Mark Etchart, and there was Mags Osheim. And Mags was the last man standing on the race for who should be president of the convention. And it ended up at the end being Mags running against Leo Grable. Tell me a little bit about that whole thing that happened in there.
Well, you know, Mags, I was very close to Mags, of course. He was in my district, and being really a novice in any kind of political process, Mags was a real mentor to me. And so I had a great appreciation for Mags and his wife, and Ellen and I were lifelong friends of theirs, you know, from the time that we met them until they died. Mags, because he had served many years, I don't know how many years, in the legislature, was really well versed in the whole process. And of course, as a delegate from that district, I was going to support him, obviously.
Of course.
But you know, the choice of Leo Grable was obviously a brilliant choice, because he turned out to be just, without Leo Grable, I don't know whether we would have had a Constitution or not. He really was adept at leadership, and you know, let people talk a lot longer than I would have, or Mags would have, I think. I mean, he was amazing in what he did.
You know, everyone reflects on that and says what a magnificent, what a difference he made.
You
know, he was I think they elected like 12 out of Great Falls, or Cascade County, and he was number 12. He almost didn't come to the convention. And then he ended up the president. It was pretty interesting that.
Well, I almost didn't come either. You know, there were 13 people who ran for those 4 slots in District 4.
You had to get by the primary.
You had to get by the primary, and so we had, I think 8 of those people were Democrats in the primary. And so in the primary, I ran in the Democratic ticket, and I finished just made the cut.
You made 4th, just 4th barely.
Yeah, just barely made 4th. So then I said, you know, did I do the right thing? Should I not have done this? You know, I don't know. You know, but anyway. Then, and I had no name recognition really beyond my local community very much. And so the whole idea of campaigning was difficult, because, you know, now I was facing, you know, 8 people running in this.
You had to run up to Plentywood.
Yeah, well, I had to go all over the district. Well, I had a lot of help with that. Stanley Neese, who was a state senator, lived in Poplar, and they were Presbyterians, Stanley and his wife, Alma. And so he was a great help, and he had a lot of connections around, so I drove around the district with him and met people, and we talked to people, and the same with Mags. You know, he was a great help. But the campaign was really kind of comical and kind of interesting. You know, I had no money. We were poor as church mice. You know, our salary was, I think when I went to Poplar as a pastor, I was going to get $6,000 a year, which was a big raise for me. So,
well, I'm thinking when I went to teach my first year in Helena, Montana in 1968, and I had one of the highest starting teacher salaries in Montana. It was $6,500 a year. You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was tough out there.
Yeah. So anyway, but I had friends. I had some connections, and I'd been part of the Junior Chamber of Commerce there, and some other local organizations.
The JCs were pretty significant in those days.
They were, yeah. And so they encouraged me, and the local banker, Jim Whitty at the Poplar Bank, was my treasurer, and so some of these folks went to work, and they raised some money for me, and so we traveled around, and I went to any organization that would have me, to speak. And I had some material made up, some little flyers and some cards. And I remember one meeting we went to, and I don't remember exactly where it was. Maybe it was Culbertson or someplace. And my wife Ellen was with me, and so we went into this building, and there were some steps going up to the room where we were meeting. And as she got to the last step, she was carrying this bag that had all my material in it, and she stumbled over something, tripped a little bit, and the basket went like that, and all of my cards fell into the wastebasket. That didn't seem like a very good omen.
Oh, goodness.
So I was prepared to say, well, I tried, but it didn't turn out. Well,
so in the general, where did you end up? Were you number 4,
actually,
number 1,
no,
number 2?
I actually was the highest vote getter in the district. And I think, as I remember, I got over 5,000 votes.
Wow.
And I don't know how many votes there were there, but anyway.
Well, it makes me think of Bob Dylan saying, "With God on my side." With God on our side. Anyway, well, so you went from 4th in the primary to 1st. Well, the value of campaigning and exposing yourself to the people.
Well, I think part of it was that I didn't have an agenda. I wasn't out to try to seal some public interest. I wasn't out to do something that was ideologically, important to some group. So I think that had a lot to do with it.
Well, people were looking for change without question.
Oh yeah.
65% of the people voted to have a convention.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of it, they were not happy with the way things were. A good deal of which had to do with the subservience of many in the state to the Anaconda Company's strong economic interests. Yeah. So the people were looking for change, and the interesting thing was that legislators or mayors or anybody that held any public office in Montana could not run.
Right. Yeah.
Now a former legislator could run, like Maggs was, but legislators could not run. And by the way, they were not happy about that.
Oh, I know they weren't.
But nonetheless, it opened the door for fresh faces and new people like yourself, and a fresh perspective, which probably served the interest of change. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think in many ways, I guess in this country we've always had a certain unrest or unease with people who are in government over a long period of time and in positions of leadership. There seems to always be this undercurrent of wanting to undercut maybe whoever's in power.
Yeah.
And so maybe that was a part of what was going on there. But more than that, it was such a time of change in this country. The whole country was in the throes of really radical change in lots of ways, culturally, socially, politically. There were things being said and done that we just never had dreamed of. And
well, and the unrest, well, the emergence of the baby boom generation, which brought a perspective to it. As Governor Ted Schwinden reflected many times, who came from your area, by the way, from Tule Creek down there, that his reflections were that when the folks came back, the men and women of Montana came back after World War II with their eyes opened a lot to a lot of things they didn't have any idea they'd run into. And then the GI Bill brought education to the fore that never was there before, that there was unrest and there was a lot of different things combined, and you put the baby boomers with it, and then all of a sudden we're thrust into the Vietnam War. And what happened with that, it was quite a time of change. You're right about that.
Well, and you see, in my own life, I had experienced a lot of that change. I was born in 1936. Went home to a dugout in the side of a hill.
Right in the middle of the Depression.
Right in the middle of the Depression, you know. Really hard time. Depression, drought, grasshoppers. It was a really difficult time, and my parents had the year that I was born, they moved to a new homestead at the confluence of Sand Creek and the Big Dry in Garfield County. And they struggled mightily and were desperately poor, although they would never have thought of themselves in that light at all. My dad, worked at other ranches sometimes, but basically what he did was he wrangled wild horses off the prairie. And by 1940, that era was over. But what came before that really set the tone. That, it doesn't matter how hard the times are going to get, we're going to survive. We're going to prevail. And so there was this sense of determination that you never give up, you keep hanging in there. And that was kind of embedded in me. In fact, I have a story that I won't go into now, but had to do with a horse race, actually, where, at 12 or 13 years old, I won a horse race in a way that just shouldn't have happened.
You never give up, though.
I never gave up, no.
Well, that may be part of the makeup of that, why they call it the greatest generation,
Yeah, well, and there's a lot to that. I mean...
you were just a little below that because you couldn't go to World War II, but nonetheless, that tenacity and that survival.
Right. Well, plus the fact that I was the first one in my family that went to college. And then after I did something that I think my parents thought I'd lost my mind. I signed up for a student abroad thing, and I went to the American University in Lebanon for a year when I was a junior in college. And
was that an eye-opener for you?
Was that an eye-opener? And I hitchhiked 1,500 miles across Africa. And, I saw the world, and I saw that what my little community that I grew up in Jordan, Montana, I saw that, boy, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world. There are a lot of other ways of deciding issues and of parsing the sentences, and so I was a part of that whole change generation that maybe was primed for what other people were also dealing with.
So. Now, when you're there at the session where Leo was elected president, I don't know if it was by happenstance or not, but they didn't know any better, I guess, or someone made a decision. Somebody said it was Dale Harris. Others said maybe that it was suggested by Chet Blaylock, but you were all seated in the House chamber alphabetically when you first got there in that organizing session. And Or were you at the?
You know, I don't
Colonial?
remember that we were.
You were at the Colonial when you organized.
Yeah, I think that the alphabetical seating came up
in January.
After the initial organizing convention in November.
And so when you come back in January and doing that, and again, I've had a number of delegates say that Chet had the idea.
Yeah, I don't
know.
remember who
I
had
don't know
the
that.
idea, but yeah.
But suddenly you're seated alphabetically. So your seatmates were
Rod Hansen.
Rod Hansen on one side and Paul Harlow on the other.
Yeah.
Someone from Trout Creek and somebody from Conrad and somebody from Poplar. You were all over the place, you guys.
Yeah.
Now, tell me your reflections on that, because that seems to come out can be something most delegates say was very important.
Well, you know, Paul Harlow was just such an amazing guy, and I learned so much from him. A lot of times we sat after the deliberations had ceased and just sat and visited in our chairs there, you know. But yeah, it really took away some of the stigma attached to the political business and the political parties. And I think it really focused the whole convention on issues rather than on, what tribe are you from? So that was a really important thing. And in fact, later on, not too many years ago, we live in New Mexico now, and I was able to talk to our state senator there, and I suggested to him that, this is what we did in the Montana Constitutional Convention. Maybe it'd be a good idea if the U.S. Senate did this. And so he went back to the next session when there had just been an inauguration. I think it was one of Barack Obama's installations. Anyway, and he went across the aisle and sat with and several of them crossed the aisle. But it never really caught on. There's just, I guess, too much baggage there. But
we may be making more of it, but it seems appealing at this time of division.
Oh yeah.
To be talking about sitting not by tribe, but by just this random thing of alphabet that you had to be capable of working with your seatmates. I mean, always the seatmates, the people on either side of you, in front of you, and back of you, are the people that you end up closest to in a constitutional convention or a legislature. So that you thought that did break down barriers.
Oh, definitely did. Yeah. Although the divisions were not as stark as they are now, but it really took away almost all of the concern about whether this was going to fit with your political party's stance, and so it had to do with the issues, and that's where and then of course people had different perspectives on issues, but it wasn't just tied to what the political party thought was the way to go.
Well, there was shared lead in the committees. The chairman of a committee was some were Democrats, some were Republicans, some were independent. Your chair was Rick Champeau,
right?
And who was vice chair? Who was vice chair? Do you remember?
I think it was Noble. I believe he was an older man.
Right.
I think he had a background in education, and he was not. He was quite old. I don't, at least from my perspective, as a 35-year-old, he was. He wouldn't be old now to me. But yeah. So
well, let's dive into a couple of the key. You were in the education and public lands.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're going to be doing in this series is we're going to also, in addition to talking with the delegates, we're going to talk with the research assistants, which in your case was Bruce Sievers was and they literally wrote a book
Oh, yeah.
and handed
yeah.
you
Yeah.
a research book that was maybe, I think Bruce's book was 700 pages.
There was a lot of reading.
And,
It was a lot of reading.
and it was like, here's what all the other states are doing on education, and here's some
Yeah.
ideas and stuff.
Yeah.
So out of that, first, do you have any reflections on that, the preliminary work that was done ahead of time with these researchers?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was invaluable. It was invaluable. You know, I have kept a lot of those manuals that they wrote. Well, they weren't manuals, they were essays on this and that and the other thing, but really helped to open your perspective of what's possible here, what are other states doing. You know, it gave you a broad perspective of how education was parsed in other states and communities, and so all of that was really helpful in you know, trying to draft an education article. And so the education article itself, one of the pieces of it that Carl Davis did not want us to really touch at all was the public lands piece and the funding of education through those public lands. And I think that there was real wisdom in that, because I think had we opened that up, it would have been maybe disastrous. But basically that was just passed on through almost as it was, as I recall.
That was a provision of the 1889 Constitution
right.
that everyone thought had some validity.
Yeah.
And because of that, we still have it, so that all public lands, state lands in Montana, that the income derived from those public lands is held in trust.
Yeah.
And it's an educational trust. And so there wasn't a lot of debate about that, or
Well, there really wasn't, no. You know, several of us, I think myself included, were kind of inclined to want to change a few words here and there, but Carl Davis was not going to open that up at all, and he sort of helped get us past the desire to do that. And I think it was wise, because it could have diverted a lot of energy and debate into something that maybe would have really damaged the reputation of the document after it was written, had we messed with that at all.
Well, you know that the Legislative Council had done a study in '67 about how much of the Constitution was worth saving, and it was like there was a third of it. A third of it, they said, some of it, third of it could be tweaked, but about 30% of it, as I recall, they said had to go. I mean, it was archaic beyond recognition. Clearly, this one was not. This was something, and Carl, by the way, was an attorney from Dillon, from the opposite corner of the state.
Yep.
Quite a guy.
Yeah.
So public lands ended up, or at least the concept of the public trust for education, you know, stood the test of time.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what was the hottest issue that you had?
Well, of course, the hottest issue had to do with the business of public aid to religious education, which was prohibited in the Constitution of '89, and that had an interesting history. Of course, the Blaine Amendment, as it was called, was something that James Blaine, who had been a candidate for the presidency back after, I believe it was after Grant sometime was president, had a very biased view of Catholics, especially Irish Catholics, and he actually was able to get through the Congress a bill that prohibited any aid to religious education, and it was an amendment to the Constitution, to the U.S. Constitution. And it passed, but it never did get adopted. I don't know, well, of course it had to be ratified.
3/4 of the states
Yeah,
had to
so
ratify
it, so it never got ratified. Anyway, what he did then, after he was defeated for president, he went across the country and he lobbied state legislators to include this in state constitutions. So there are 37 constitutions in the country that have almost identical articles that reflect that Blaine Amendment, which he pushed through Congress. And it was a kind of solid wall of separation, as he understood it, between church and state when it came to the matter of dispersing public funds. And so our '89 Constitution had that provision in it that no direct or indirect aid could go to parochial education or any kind of other religious institutions. Well, part of the problem at that time was that many private schools and religious schools were not able to access some of the federal programs that were available to them because of that provision. And so there was, we had a day when we had an open hearing on the issue, and a lot of people came, and I received a lot of mail. Everybody received a lot of mail, trying to persuade us to do something so that Montana didn't get penalized, at least, for having this in their constitution and could access those funds that came from the federal sources. So that was the reason that Jerry Londorf and I introduced this little section in.
Now that was an ecumenical movement in and of itself.
Well, it was.
The Presbyterian from Poplar,
Yeah.
and the Deep Catholic from Helena,
Yeah.
the Carroll College Catholic from Helena, got together on something here. Yeah,
We did. And so we put in Section 6, which was the old Section 8 in the old Constitution.
What did the primary section read?
Well, the primary section says the legislature, the counties, the cities, the towns, the school districts, public corporations shall not make any direct or indirect appropriation or payment from any public fund or monies or any grant of lands or other property for any sectarian purpose or to aid any church, school, academy, seminary, college, university, or other literary or scientific institution controlled in whole or in part by any church, sect, or denomination.
Very strong language.
That is very strong language. That is a very tight paragraph.
Hey, that was written by someone from LaSalle or Harvard. I don't know which.
Well, so Jerry and I proposed this section 2.
It's a subsection of that.
Subsection 2 to section 6. This section shall not apply to funds from federal sources provided to the state for the express purpose of distribution to non-public education. And after a lot of debate and back and forth, that became a part of the document. And of course, in very recent times, that is what has come into
We've had
question.
dispute over that, including a U.S. Supreme Court case, which has rendered it somewhat impotent right now, but it's still there in some ways. Anyway, that was the big battle.
That was really a big battle. And interestingly, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still alive, Maynann Ellington and I were able to get tickets from her to go to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. in January of 2020. And we went to the hearing of the Espinoza versus Montana case, which challenged that section of the Constitution. It seemed to me really quite ironic that people were challenging a section where I, at least, was trying to soften that situation a little bit. And, you know, that was certainly pushing it as far as it could go. You couldn't have gotten any more, you know, leniency than that. But what was really a kind of special thing for me was that at that hearing of the Supreme Court before the justices, I sat with Leo Grable's grandson.
Rafe.
And we sat together and watched that hearing. And of course, the outcome was not what we would have wanted. And still, I'm a bit puzzled by how the court is going to deal with this, because what their decision meant is that section of the Constitution is unconstitutional by the U.S. federal Constitution. Yeah. If that be the case, then where are we? Where are we today with aid to public education and aid to, private and parochial education?
Well, I would have to say that it's starting to run rampant because of that decision.
Sure it is.
Where somebody can actually get a tax credit of up to $200,000 for putting money into either charter education or even public, but or parochial education. They can a rich person can put that in, and the state of Montana has to write a check of $200,000 back to them with your tax dollars to compensate them for channeling their money into it, and then they get it back from the state. It's really getting kind of goofy, but we'll have to see how it plays out. I wanted to, and by the way, Chairman Champeau mentioned that all-day hearing you had was really kind of diffused the issue somewhat, because everybody got all their stuff out on the table. So that might have been a good leadership thing. But let me ask you about something that is right in the fore right now, because the recent legislatures have taken a number of actions that seem to impede or try to impede the ability of the Board of Regents to manage the university system. One of the things in your education plank was one that says the regents of Montana have full management control of the university system. And now all the time the legislature is trying to chip in on that, and that came because of a lot of history, where there's history in Montana where I know the Levine case in Missoula back in about 1920. He was audacious enough to write a factual book that showed that the Anaconda Company didn't pay any taxes on their mining, and of course he got fired.
Yeah.
So politics was reaching into the university system, and the protection of that was done. Do you recall that debate about the university system and the control of it? Was it a big debate, or did it seem natural to have that?
Well, I don't think it was, it certainly wasn't as consuming as a lot of the other issues that we had, but it was a significant change there from what there had been. But I didn't think it was that big an issue as far as the convention was concerned.
Yeah, it's interesting that because it took on import immediately. You may recall that right after the implementation of the Constitution, that you created a position called the Commissioner of Higher Education, and you had kind of somebody on top of higher education in Montana, and the board for that position had management control, and immediately the next legislature tried to say, no, that's all right, you can't do that. We're gonna control this thing, and there had to be a lawsuit at that time against Governor Judge, who just happened to be the guy they could give the envelope to.
Yep.
And they took that on, and the Supreme Court said it means what it says. The regions have control.
Yeah.
And yet that is 50 years later. Right now there are 5 or 6 lawsuits about the recent legislature trying to impede the management of the university system.
Yeah. Well, I think it's part of the toxic environment that we've got politically, that those kind of things are taking place. And I guess from my perspective, I think that many times the motives of people who are trying to change some of these things are really questionable, because we have to have trust in this country, in our institutions. We have to have trust in people who are well qualified for serving the public. And some of the voices that are ringing out probably are not as well informed on the issue as the experts are, and they have ulterior motives. So, you know, who knows where it will go. I've always said that I think that people get the kind of government they deserve, for good or for ill, which is why we put in the Constitution the provision that every 20 years we take this out and look at it and say, you know, do we really want to do this? Or is there, you know, do we want to make some changes? Do we want to have another convention to see what we can do? Well, there's no way we would have another convention that would produce anything now because of our divisive political system. But, you know, it was, I think it was, our Constitution was not written for a day. It was written really for the future, I think. The environmental article, you know, really is an example of that. Well, there are lots of examples of it in the Constitution, but it was a forward-looking document, and the efforts put into it were saying, you know, we don't know all the answers, and maybe down the line you'll want to change this. Well, for good or for ill, I think people will get the kind of government they deserve.
Well, you did provide a vehicle for people to amend the Constitution, because in the old Constitution, the legislature had to produce the changes in the Constitution, and that wasn't a very, so you opened the door for a constitutional initiative, which has brought about some really good constitutional change and some questionable.
You're right.
You know, so it's kind of the way it is. Well, we are getting close to the end here of our wonderful hour. It's been great talking to you. Would you give us would you say that, how would you rank this experience with all the other experiences in your life?
Well, you know, it was a very important experience in that it gave me a lot of insight into the political process. It gave me a great appreciation for people who enter into the political process. And I think that one of the things that people don't realize is the kind of well, I guess sacrifice really that people often make in order to become involved in something like this. You know, it's a costly thing in many ways, socially, economically, however you look at it. Often it's a costly process. But as far as my own life experience, it was a very important experience. I wouldn't say it was the most important in my life, but it certainly is an important part of what I would consider my legacy, you know, as an individual.
Well, let me just say that as a citizen of Montana, I would like to express my appreciation on this 50th anniversary for the wonderful role you played and all of your fellow delegates in writing this document that is we call it the last best Constitution. And I think in America, most people think it is. So, Gene Harbaugh, thank you very much for your service,
Well,
and
thank
thanks
you
for being here.
Yeah, thank you for doing this interview.